Another method for classifying organisms and their phylogenies is a cladogram, which is a diagram that depicts patterns of shared characteristics among groups. When you get these organisms into a group, it's called a clade, which is a group of species that includes an ancestral species and all of the descendants. Now, what you use to make a cladogram is you would use shared derived characteristics, which are used to make these cladograms. So looking at the diagram, you can see the cladogram. So at the very bottom, you start with an outgroup. So this is going to be a type of species typically that diverged early on in time and is closely related but doesn't share all of those derived characteristics that every other organism has in this chart or diagram. So it's for comparative purposes, and again, diverged way early on from a way early on common ancestor. The other organisms above that outgroup have to have shared derived characteristics, and it's going to get more specific as we go towards the top of that linear line, which is somewhat diagonal. So starting at the bottom, the very first characteristic is going to be called ancestral, because other than the outgroup, they all have a vertebrae. So that's the first shared ancestral characteristic. And then we're going to go hinge jaws for walking legs, and everything above the different colors here, everything above it has the characteristic mentioned or shown. So vertebrae, lamprey has a vertebrae, tuna, salamander, turtle, and then leopard. Everything above that, again, they all have. And then moving without having to read the entire thing, going towards the top, hair is a derived characteristic. It's one of the last derived characteristics, and the only organism that has it is the leopard. Now, it doesn't have to be just one organism. So, for example, it might be leopards and lions. So it's not always necessarily the very last characteristic, but again, it could be several, but it is the very last one. So it's the last derived characteristic on this cladogram. When looking at diagrams of trees, there's going to be three different types based on the type of organisms that are highlighted. So looking at letter A, this is a monophyletic group, which is the equivalent of a clade. So group 1 would be something that you would make a cladogram from. And again, this would have all the organisms that were derived from a common ancestor. Now in option or letter B, paraphyletic group, these organisms that are highlighted have most of the derived organisms, but one of them, letter G, is missing. So for this reason, it would not be considered a monophyletic group, but a paraphyletic group. And finally, letter C, these organisms that are highlighted do not include the most common ancestor, and it also includes an organism that doesn't have a recent ancestor, which would be letter D on that tree. So looking at the three options and trying to figure out which one to derive a cladogram, monophyletic is the best option because, again, all of the organisms are derived from a common ancestor, a recent common ancestor. This slide shows you how to construct a phylogenetic tree using a table or chart to keep the organisms and their characteristics kind of organized in a sense. You can also use that table to make a cladogram as well. So the first thing when you have a table, you want to have the organisms written across the top. The outgroup should be written to the left. The outgroup, again, is a distantly related ancestor, if you will. It's not really related to the other organisms that are being provided. It was derived or separated from the group a really, really, really long time ago. So you would write that first, and it doesn't have any of the shared at all characteristics. It doesn't share the ancestral characteristic, and it doesn't have any of the derived ones. And then as you move across the top of the table, going towards the right, every organism should have more and more and more and more of those traits. And then the traits are written along the left-hand side of the table. Sometimes traits are called characters. I typically call them characteristics. And then you would write them across again, the left-hand side. So every row will show you whether or not the organism has it. Sometimes you'll see yeses and nos written in the boxes. In this case, it's zeros indicating that the trait is absent. A 1 obviously indicates that the trait is present. So the very first trait showing that there's a vertebrae on this table is the ancestral trait. So they all have it minus that outgroup. And then the hinged jaws, they all have it minus the outgroup and one other organism. So we're getting more specific in terms of the organisms and what characters that they have. So 4 limbs, again, outgroup doesn't have it, another organism doesn't have it, and then yet again another one, and so on until at the end, whatever the last trait that is written, typically only one organism or one type of species is going to have that characteristics. It doesn't always have to be just one, but usually it's one group. So in this case, hare, we're just talking about the leopard. So you have the table already organized, and then you actually, in this case, make a phylogenetic tree. I put a red dot, a circle representing a branch point. Again, the branch point is going to be a shared common ancestor that the outgroup derived from, and then very differently derived or evolved from all the others. So then we have the outgroup separate on its own branch, and then you'll make a branch, and this has to include everything that has a vertebrae, because that's the ancestral trait. Then you make another branch, and I didn't circle it in red, but it would be right to the left of where it says the vertebrae column. So then a branch going upward, which is going to include the lamprey, and the lamprey is essentially being excluded at this point because it doesn't have a hinged jaw. So everything on that next branch better have a hinged jaw. So then you make another separation or branch, and the bass now is essentially being excluded because it doesn't have 4 limbs. And then you make another branch. The frog is being excluded because it doesn't develop in an amniotic sac. And then another branch, and the reason why turtles don't have hair, and then the leopard is the only organism that does. So this is a phylogenetic tree that is based on that table or chart, and I will show you a cladogram based on a similar chart in just a moment. So I thought on the next slide we were going to be making a cladogram, but we are in fact making a phylogenetic tree. So now, based on this table, which is already organized with the characters listed on the left and then the organisms, including that outgroup, listed across the top, moving towards the right in the dolphin. So make a phylogenetic tree similar to the last slide. Now this one does have a little bit of a trick with the dorsal fin. So see if you can figure out what exactly you should use. The characteristics are numbered, so you can use hatch marks and numbers, or you can actually write in the characteristic. It won't make a difference either way. So take a minute. I know the next slide is going to pop up in a second, but really pause this and make sure you are able to do it on your own. So I'll sit here for a second so the answer doesn't pop up right away. But again, take time, figure it out, draw it out before you cheat and look at the answer. Okay, so here is the answer of what your phylogenetic tree should look like. And there's a trick on this one. So the tuna doesn't quite follow protocol. Again, in real life, when you make these tables, sometimes things don't work perfectly. So the reason that the tuna is where it is, and then I'll address the 6 in a second. So the tuna has a backbone. Again, everything else, that's the ancestral trait. All the organisms minus the outgroup has a backbone in it. Then we have a hinged jaw. So tuna, everything else minus the lamprey and the outgroup has a hinged jaw. Now, in terms of all the majority of the other characteristics, the tuna doesn't have, the fish, it's a fish, it doesn't have limbs, it does not develop in an amniotic sac, it doesn't produce milk, but similar to the dolphin, it does have a dorsal fin. So a fin like on its back or the top of it. So for this exception, you would then write in a hatch mark and put the number 6 or write in the dorsal fin. So it is a characteristic that over time was derived, but you want to stick with the fluidity of making the phylogenetic tree and then backtrack, because minus that characteristic, it does fit where it should be, and then you just have to backtrack with the one extra trait, which is an acceptable thing to do. It's not typical, but you may see it from time to time. Okay, the last important part of making a phylogenetic tree is the principle of maximum parsimony, which basically says that when you're trying to develop different types of phylogenetic trees based on data that you're being presented, sometimes it's not as easy to figure out what should be grouped together with what has the most similarities, what should be an outgroup. So this chart that it's showing you is actually a little bit more complex, showing you an ancestral sequence and then different nitrogenous bases being different based on the species, 3 different species of birds. So there are 3 different options, pairing up 1 and 2, saying that they're the most similar in terms of the species, and then 3 would be the furthest out group. And then the second option, so this would be under the green bird in the middle, the second hypothesis or second option for a phylogenetic tree is grouping together 1 and 3, those species, and then kind of leaving the second species out. And then furthest on the right, clumping together the third and the second species, and then leaving 1, saying that that's the most different, basically. So when we're trying to figure this out, what's right and what's wrong, again, this is a lot, I think a little bit above just basics of phylogeny and phylogenetic trees.
But the right answer in terms of which one is right is going to be the first phylogenetic tree on the bottom towards the left or kind of in the middle of the page. The reason is that there are the fewest changes in bases. There's only 6 events taking place in that first phylogenetic tree. The other ones, when you clump them together, there's going to be 7 differences between them. So you want to keep the fewest events, fewest changes, fewest branches, sometimes fewest characteristics. Try to keep it as brief as you possibly can to show that there's an evolutionary history with these traits. So for this slide, I'm not so concerned with this one being able to make a phylogenetic tree based on that data chart, but make sure you understand maximum parsimony. If you're able to see the differences between the 3 hypotheses, that's great. But make sure you understand, keep it simple, and what maximum parsimony means.